This lovely lecture will cover the revolutionary religious Reformation in Europe. In a year-long European history class, you would spend at least 2 weeks getting into the nitty-gritty of the Reformation, because it was extremely impactful on Europe. In this course, however, we go a little faster. This will simply review the major figures and wars caused by the Reformation. To get to the Reformation, we have to first understand how the Renaissance impacted the era. The Renaissance revived old manuscripts from Aristotle, Cicero, Ptolemy, Plato, and other famous Greeks and Romans. The study of these so-called classics caused a revival in education that would be known as the liberal arts. People like Petrarch and Boccaccio founded what is called humanism, part of this whole new educational style. Of course, that expanded to the arts, where artists sought to copy stuff from the past as well. Humanism impacted the Renaissance in Italy greatly, but it also went north to Germany, the Netherlands, France, and other places. This northern humanism focused less on translations of Aristotle and Plato, and focused instead on the early church in Rome. They compared the 15th and 16th century church to the early Christian church and found the modern-day church to be lacking in morality and the true passion for Christ. This is where it all starts to impact the Reformation itself. Italian art was impacted by humanism in a lot of ways. It brought back the Greek and Roman styles in art and architecture. Da Vinci and Michelangelo's masterpieces have lasted throughout time. But a lot of people forget that there was also a Renaissance in the North. It just looked a bit different and is not as appreciated as the Italian masters. The art of the North was impacted by humanism differently. You can even see the difference just in the style of painting, with its bolder colors and stark contrasts. Although the Italian Renaissance art was also religious, David, the Last Supper, Madonnas, this was almost more so. The point of the art was to convey what humanity had been and what it had become in their early modern world. Paintings of Adam and Eve sinning were a favorite because it displays humanity. The emotion of Christ being taken from the cross in this Van der Weyden, the Tower of Babel when humanity tried to reach God and failed, this one's by Bruegel. All of these became signature pieces of the North. People were reconciling the New Testament translations of what the early church was against what Europe had become. Albrecht Dürer created masterpiece by carving into wood, like the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Hieronymus Bosch painted disturbing paintings of hell and damnation, as well as paintings mocking current European life. He illustrated books for Northern Renaissance humanist writers who began to critique the church, and this is where we get into the Reformation itself, these critiques of that church. Critics were attacking some practices that they viewed as corrupt. Simony, or the practice of giving money for church positions, had become rampant. Nepotism had also become a huge issue. Nepotism is basically putting your supporters, like family and friends, into high positions. This also ties into celibacy because plenty of church officials, including some very prominent popes like Alexander VI pictured here, were placing their illegitimate children into prominent positions. Indulgences had become common practice as well. With indulgences, originally you would do an act of service to the church to take years off of your time in purgatory, or the middle world between heaven and hell. Indulgences simply became monetary, meaning you paid money for a piece of paper that said how many years you eliminated off of your sentence. You could even pay to get grandma out of purgatory too. The church was using this money for its own purposes, like to build St. Peter's Basilica. There were also questions of salvation. Was it faith or works that saved you? Does salvation exist outside the Roman Catholic Church? If not, what about Greek Orthodox Christians? Also, why must the Bible be in Latin? Why don't you want the average person to be able to read it? Wycliffe translated the Bible into English, Huss supported Wycliffe, and Erasmus wrote anonymous critiques of the church. These three guys were pretty much precursors to Luther. Martin Luther is generally seen as the man who ripped Europe apart in the 1500s. A little monk in Little Wittenberg, he was fairly insignificant at the outset. But after a trip to Rome, where he saw firsthand indulgences, lack of celibacy, belief in the touching of relics, and more, he began to challenge the practices of the church leaders. He originally dedicated his 95 Theses, published in 1517, to the Pope because he didn't think the corruption went that high. This, of course, meant that his works went straight to the top, and they had him excommunicated and tried in Worms in 1521. He would have been killed, except that a friendly prince in Germany kidnapped him and put him in hiding. While in hiding, he produced the New Testament in German. This is one of his most remarkable achievements. What is interesting about his story is that, like so many others, he only intended to save the church from itself. He wanted to reform it, not to break from it. So he ended up breaking with the church, and of course, his followers called themselves Lutherans. There are plenty of unintended consequences from Luther's trial and excommunication. While he was in hiding, the peasants broke out in a full-scale rebellion against their nobles. The religious equality that Luther had sought was now seeping into the rhetoric of the lower classes. They sought full revolution and began attacking and murdering nobles across the land. Luther was against these full-scale peasant rebellions because he felt that they had twisted his words. It wasn't about equality on this earth, it was about heavenly equality. The nobility responded by murdering peasants en masse. All of this was devastating to Germany, but the conflicts over religion and equality were just beginning. A very different Reformation came in England. Henry VIII was initially completely against Luther and any Reformation. He even had his advisor, Thomas More, write a paper that defended the Catholic Church. For this, the Pope gave him the title Defender of the Faith in 1521. 10 years changed everything, though. He had married Catherine of Aragon, Princess of Spain, as a political alliance, and they had been married for over 24 years. She had only given him one daughter who survived, later Queen Mary. He wanted a son, a legitimate son since he had several from his mistresses, to carry on his growing legacy. He was expanding the navy, making England into a powerhouse. So he appealed to the Pope to grant a divorce or an annulment of their marriage. The Pope, of course, said no, and long story short, Henry broke with the Church in 1533 and began his own Church of England. It looked very much like the Catholic Church, just with Henry at the top instead of the Pope. He then confiscated the Church's land and buildings, like Westminster Abbey, closed them, and took all the money from the monasteries and used the money for his own purposes. He became famous at that point for marrying 6 women total, beheading 2 of them for treason, and engaging in another divorce. Although his story is crazy and interesting, the fact that it was now considered acceptable to break from the Church is the most important part of this tale. England would be torn apart for a little while after his death due to the nature of his children. His only son Edward ruled for only 6 years, from when he was 10 to 16 years old. He died young, so his reign was really his regent's reign, as they made decisions for him. His sister Mary succeeded him, but she was very Roman Catholic, as her mother had been. She married Philip II of Spain, also a militant Catholic, intent on spreading the religion and turning England Catholic once more. She became known as Bloody Mary for executing almost 300 prominent upper-class Protestants during her short reign. It was the famous Elizabeth I who actually continued her father's legacy by officially returning to the Anglican Church of England, funding exploration in the arts, defeating Spain's Armada, and ensuring that the Catholics and Protestants both could worship freely. So religion played a huge role in making England what it would become. John Calvin is our French/Swiss crossover. He was a French citizen who moved to Geneva because of the persecution against Protestants in a very Catholic France. Calvin spread the Protestant ideal by founding another church and by writing a pamphlet that succinctly summarized his Protestant doctrine. His doctrine included predestination. This was the idea that God had predestined some for heaven and some for hell ahead of time. He is also famous for making Geneva a center of missionary activity. This would eventually mean that Calvinism would overshadow Lutheranism even in the German territories. By the time Calvin came around, the Reformation was under full swing, and the Catholics had to respond. The Catholic Reformation, also called the Counter-Reformation, began with the Council of Trent in 1545. The council system had been in place for a while by that point, and the purpose of a council like this was to determine what they do truly believe, and what to do about the growing discontent with the Catholic Church. Basically, the Church needed to reform in order to keep its current members as well as to hopefully win some back. The Council of Trent decided over the course of 2 decades what they thought was appropriate. First, the RCC would keep all 7 sacraments. Luther only wanted 2. They'd also keep celibacy, but enforce it, and actually make education for priests a priority. They decided to keep the Bible in Latin, but at the same time help priests better understand that Latin so they would understand what they were saying. That way priests could also fight against men like Luther theologically. Another key figure in that movement was Ignatius of Loyola, a reform-minded monk who wished to work with the Catholic Church. He founded the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, to accomplish this task. The idea was that so many people left because they did not feel a personal connection with the Church. The Jesuits and Loyola sought to bring back the emotion within the Church as well as to reform it from the inside. He sought to appeal to traditions within the church, but also to give to the poor. The Jesuits founded educational institutions, hospitals, and more for the poor to win them back to Catholicism, and a lot of the times it worked. The Reformation didn't just stop at changing the papacy and the church doctrine. This was also the era of increased witch hunting and a craze to stop witches from practicing their devilish ways. This era of instability bred an increase in the witch hunts, especially in the lower classes. Old widowed women, people who were healers in their communities, and midwives were often targeted, although men were targeted as well. 85% of those accused were women, though. These women, and sometimes men, were targeted because they were often on the fringes of society or worked with herbs and medicine, which caused distrust. By the 1700s, though, the witch craze had ended, in part because the accusations were getting ridiculous, and in part because the scientific revolution had taken hold, dispelling a lot of those old religious superstitions. Of course, we cannot forget about the struggles that ensued because of religion in Europe. War almost became endemic during the 16th and 17th centuries. The untimely death of Henry II in France, due to an unfortunate jousting accident, led to a power struggle. Yes, he did have 3 sons, but they were young and inexperienced. Their regent was their mother, Catherine de' Medici, an Italian who was not welcome at all in France. She struggled to maintain the throne for her sons while rival Protestant and Catholic families attempted to take it from her. At one point, open warfare was declared on Protestants in the streets of Paris. The bloodbath that followed has been called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, in which 20,000 French Calvinists, also known as Huguenots, were massacred. Eventually, her 3 sons all perished, leaving the Protestant Henry of the Bourbon Protestants as the new king. Yeah, I know, they're all named Henry, and I'm sorry. He, however, converted to Catholicism to appease the majority of his populace because France was very Catholic. But he still allowed Protestants the ability to worship privately through the Edict of Nantes in 1598. This is similar, as you probably figured out, to Elizabeth. It's just backwards. She was a Protestant but allowed Catholics to worship privately in their own homes. You just can't flaunt it. So here's the question. How religious was this? Yes, it had religious undertones in the family alliances, but mostly the families were using the religious leanings to gain followers and thus gain the throne. Spain's Philip II was involved in quite a few religious wars himself as a militant Catholic, meaning he went to extremes for his religious beliefs. First, he enlisted his half-brother Don Juan to fight the Ottoman Turks. The Pope even joined this one with Venice to create a Holy League. After defeating the Turks, Spain had to deal with their provinces in the Netherlands revolting for independence. He lost against them in the end, even though he enlisted ruthless men to persecute the so-called heretics who wanted independence and wished to be Protestant. So the Netherlands got their independence and became Protestant. Lastly, the die-hard Catholic had renewed Catholic England to its former glory when he married Mary I. The problem is, Elizabeth became queen. She eventually executed a Scottish queen who had happened to be Catholic as well, and that prompted him to invade English waters. Unfortunately for him, he'd lose that struggle too. Thus, by the end of the 1500s, Spain had won and lost several battles for the Catholic faith and almost bankrupted the country. This is why we won't hear as much from Spain in the future. They just spent too much money and had too little gain. The last religious war, the 30 Years' War, was the most devastating. Religious war had been constant since the Peasant Wars because princes wanted the right to choose their own religion, and they were able to choose between Lutheran and Catholic by 1555. By 1618, however, that arrangement was challenged when a Catholic prince succeeded the throne of a very Protestant area known as Bohemia. War broke out when Protestants held a mock trial and, as punishment, threw Catholics out of a window in Prague. So as you can see, it started out with Protestants fighting for what they perceived to be their religious freedom from a Catholic overlord. There were 4 phases to this war, though, and each phase became increasingly less religious. By the time it was over, France, a Catholic country, was primarily fighting against the Holy Roman Empire, another Catholic country. The Peace of Westphalia finally ended the bloodbath in 1648, setting up a more modern map of boundaries for countries. Switzerland and the Netherlands were granted independence, for example. It was about time, because not only had the violence of the soldiers depleted the population, the most fertile farmland was destroyed in the fighting and left thousands of people without food. The map here shows the devastation by area. Overall, you can tell that the religious implications of the Reformation had far-reaching effects on early modern Europe. This is all happening at the same time as their exploration, when Europeans were attempting to dominate the world. So after this is over, religious wars I mean, they continue to focus outward rather than inward, which will definitely affect the rest of the world.